It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
Hi, this is Joe from Vanta. In today's digital world, compliance regulations are changing constantly, and earning customer trust has never mattered more. Vanta helps companies get compliant fast and stay secure with the most advanced AI, automation, and continuous monitoring out there. So whether you're a startup going for your first SOC 2 or ISO 27001, or a growing enterprise managing vendor risk, Vanta makes it quick, easy, and scalable. And I'm not just saying that because I work here. Get started at Vanta.com.
From writer-director Ryan Johnson.
The Holy Grail. A perfectly impossible crime.
Wake Up Dead Man has critics singing its praises.
God help me. Anything else?
It's a deliciously entertaining mystery.
That's nice.
It's certified fresh.
It's a miracle!
Okay, you're freaking me out now.
It's the best Knives Out movie yet.
This case is solvable, right?
Oh, you'll see. It's fun.
Wake Up Dead Man, a Knives Out mystery starring Daniel Craig. Now played in select theaters on Netflix December 12th, rated PG-13.
And there's an old joke, isn't there, that, if everybody who claimed to have been involved in the Iranian Embassy siege had actually been involved in the Iranian Embassy siege, the balcony would have fallen off. There were only 4 people ever on that front balcony, and only one of them is still around. And he, before this book, had never talked about his experience. He had never given an interview to anybody.
Hello. On the 30th of April 1980, 6 armed Kuzhestanis burst into the Iranian Embassy at number 16 Prince's Gate in the smart London neighbourhood of Kensington, so beginning a 6-day siege that ended in dramatic scenes, broadcast on live TV as members of the SAS smashed their way into the British consciousness and the building, bringing to an end the terrorist attack in a ruthlessly executed operation. Joining me is best-selling author Ben Macintyre as we discuss Operation Nimrod, the SAS, the hostages, and the significance of the event to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Plenty more great history on the way, so please do subscribe and follow. But just one little shout out to Gemma, who's just given birth to a little baby girl, Aurora, which is a beautiful name. I'm sure you can all join me in congratulating Gemma. Anyway, if you can see it to giving me a kind review, that would be marvellous. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand you over to me and Ben Macintyre on the Iranian Embassy siege. Ben, welcome back to the pod. It's absolute pleasure to have you back on for your new book. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's an absolute delight to be here. Wonderful.
When this dropped, well, actually, when I saw the email arrive in my inbox, I was hugely excited because as a child born in 75, child of the 80s, the Iranian Embassy siege is burnt in my brain as this kind of key moment that every schoolboy loves reading about. It's sort of this wonderful siege of bad guys and good guys. So I was very excited. But it's a lot more complicated than that, isn't it, Ben?
It is. It is. I mean, I'm a bit older than you, Oliver. So I was 14 when this happened. And I watched it. Well, I was watching the snooker, actually. I was watching the World Snooker Championship with Hurricane Higgins and Cliff Thorburn. And it was just coming down to the wire. I was watching it with my dad. It was a bank holiday Monday. 14 million people were watching that snooker, and it cut away from the snooker to the scene at the Iranian embassy of men in balaclava kit, black outfits, abseiling down the outside of the building, throwing in. And it was the most exciting thing I'd ever seen. And it was really the first piece of live news television anyone had ever seen. I mean, in those days, that didn't happen. Not that, it was... now we're completely used to it. News arrives by every conceivable handheld implement. Then it was unheard of, and it was so exciting. And like you, it kind of settled into a kind of myth part of my brain, as it did for all sorts of people. It became a kind of iconic, I hate that word, but it became a very heavily symbolic moment for lots of people, for good reasons too. But the real story of the Iranian embassy siege is much more fascinating, I think, than simply a tale of SAS daring do. I mean, there is plenty of that, believe me. I mean, the last part of it is extremely kinetic, as they would say in military parlance. But it's for me, the fascinating bit is the sort of 6 days leading up to that moment, which, as you rightly say, is not the story that we all seem to think that it is. I mean, I think if you asked anybody in the street who were the gunmen who went into that embassy, and this doesn't sound patronizing, but 9 out of 10 would say, oh, these were Islamic fundamentalists bent on, doing a bad thing in Britain. That was not true. These guys were not. These were, one has to see the historical context of it for a start, which is that the revolution in Iran had taken place in 1979. The Ayatollah and an extreme fundamentalist government had come to power. And in the Iranian embassy in London, the representatives of that power, the Ayatollah's men, were in charge. And the gunmen were opposed to them. They were attacking those people because they were Arab Iranians who were fighting for greater autonomy in the southwestern part of Iran, which is called Kuzhestan. And it's the oil-rich area. And the Arabs there are some 4 million of them, had always felt like a beleaguered minority in Iran. And when the revolution came along, they supported the revolution wholeheartedly against the Shah, believing, and indeed they were promised, that they would win political rights as a result. Now, that did not happen. And the Ayatollah's security services clamped down on the Arab protests in Kuzhestan in the most brutal way. Hundreds were killed. And that created, or helped to create, a violent guerrilla movement on the part of these Arabs. And so that was really what they were doing. They were attacking the Iranian embassy because they believed that they would get a good hearing in Britain. They believed that Britain would help them force the Ayatollah to release political prisoners in Iran. And they would take hostages, but those hostages would be Iranians. They would be Iranians representing a regime that they opposed. They would hold them hostage for 24 hours, and then they would fly home. That was their plan. They did not anticipate a 6-day siege. And so in a way, that's already, to me, that's more interesting than a story about, bad fundamentalists going in with suicide vests. It's in each of those 6 gunmen, there were 6 of them, had their own backstory. They're all interesting humans. I'm not defending them. They were men of violence, but they all had reasons, or as they saw it, reasons for doing what they were doing.
Well, I mentioned the cause of Arabistan and these terrorists to my Iranian mother-in-law, who really is, aware of Kuzhestan, which is the Farsi name, I believe, and is really unaware of any kind of attempt at autonomy. And that's what they were really after, was autonomy rather than independence. Yeah,
they did not want to break away from Iran. It's one of those accidents of history, really. Had the sheikhs of Arabistan managed to establish independence in the 1920s, that part of the world would be another Kuwait, another Qatar, another very rich petrostate. Because of the kind of flips of history, it ended up being part of a greater Iran. And yeah, I mean, it's a story that is it's almost unknown in the West. Although it continues to this day, there is still a sort of independence movement down there, heavily repressed by the Iranian state. I mean, the other sort of, as it were, geopolitical element of this is that we're talking about the run-up to the Iran-Iraq war. And these gunmen were bankrolled and trained by Saddam Hussein. So so for Saddam, it was, in a way, it was a very easy way to destabilize the hated Iranian regime next door. He was encouraging guerrilla tactics against the Iranians. So he was posing as the great leader of the Arab world. So for him, this was a huge political advantage. And these guys, not just them, but others too, had been taken to training bases outside Baghdad, where they were taught how to do what they were going to do. And the whole plot was actually cooked up by Saddam Hussein's security service, the Mukhabarat, the unbelievably ruthless kind of internal and external security service, a particular section of it. But one of the things that I discovered in the course of this research, which has never been revealed before, was that the individual in charge of this operation was actually the world's most wanted terrorist. It was Abu Nidal, a Palestinian extreme radical, at one point believed to have carried out more terrorist attacks than anybody else, who at that point in 1980 was working and living in Baghdad as a kind of freelance terrorist advisor to Saddam Hussein. So you've got a much bigger story going on behind this what appears to be a kind of discrete moment in this assault on the embassy. And in lots of, I mean, the Iran-Iraq war explodes just a few months later. You can see what happened in Prince's Gate in this embassy as the kind of forerunner of that appalling conflict. That, in a way, the first battle of the Iran-Iraq war was being fought out in Kensington.
Well, there's a simplistic view by some, and we'll get on to the siege, of course, but there's a simplistic view by some that Saddam is an ally of the US and the UK during the 80s. And so this really does, that provides a corrective.
At Carafem, you can choose the abortion care that works best for you. With in-person visits in Atlanta, Chicago, and the D.C. area, or medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. Some people feel more comfortable meeting with a provider in person and leaving either no longer pregnant or with pills in hand. Others prefer getting abortion pills by mail. Just fill out a short online form, and if eligible, your medication arrives in a few days in a plain package. When you choose abortion pills, Cara, our text-based abortion companion, is with you every step of the way, offering 24/7 support and answers whenever you need them. However you get care, Carafem will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carafem.org.
It does. I mean, there's an awful lot of cynical manipulation going on in the Middle East at this point. Saddam is an extraordinarily brutal opportunist who will do whatever he has to do to get the arms that he wants in order to prosecute his battle against the Iranians. So it's a complicated moment, and the West is deeply implicated in it. Don't get me wrong, but so are the Soviets. I mean, the Soviets are also, playing both sides against the middle, arming both sides. It's a highly complex and volatile situation. We haven't got to the moment yet when, Iraq is clearly on the other side, is clearly inimical to Western interests. But there's a direct historical line that runs from the Iran-Iraq war to the Gulf Wars, and from the Gulf Wars to 9/11, and from 9/11 to Afghanistan. These are all connected. And I think at its most sort of basic, the battle inside that embassy was between people who had utter belief in their own faith on both sides, one religious, one secular, but intensely ideological. These are men of violence who believed that violence was the way to prosecute their aims and their ends. And, these are highly volatile political times in 1980, but they're not so different from our own times. I mean, I think if we try to understand what is happening in the Middle East at the moment, then a decent place to start actually is number 16 Prince's Gate.
Well, the 6th terrorists who do storm the embassy on that first day, they are, as you say, they're men of violence. But one does have, as I was reading through the book, a certain sympathy for them. And, obviously the cause they have, one can understand it. And it's very much a story of human beings. And the leader in particular, I think, is someone who has suffered terribly throughout his entire life.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, this was a complete revelation to me. I mean, I had no idea that I was going to find humane individuals behind the kind of, the sort of terrorist face, if you like. And I've been quite careful to try and avoid the word terrorist in a way, because I think it's so loaded. And they were prepared to use terror, but they weren't kind of strapped up suicide bombers, just, murdering civilians willy-nilly. They had a political cause. They saw themselves as freedom fighters. They believed, not without reason, that they were an oppressed minority. Let's look at, this happened in the era of the IRA. In a way, they're not a million miles away from some of those characters as well. And the character of Tawfiq al-Rashidi, who is the leader of this group, is also not what I was expecting. He is a highly educated, multilingual, university graduate with a great love of British culture. He is a cultured man, but in the 2 years previous to this event, he had seen the Ayatollah's Revolutionary Guard murder his friends in huge numbers. He had seen the cause that he believed in brutally suppressed. And his brother, a man that he absolutely idolized, who was also part of this Arab autonomy movement, was captured by the Iranian Secret Service, tortured, and then murdered. And that happened 8 months before this event. And so, there are human motivations. So in a way, Tawfiq al-Rashidi saw himself partly as kind of striking a blow against a hated regime that had destroyed his brother. So there is a personal motive that sits at the heart of this story. But he was manipulated. I mean, he was a naive person in spite of his high intelligence. He was manipulated and maneuvered by Saddam Hussein's Mukhabarat thugs they had no interest in his survival, no interest in his cause. This was just a way for them to strike a blow at the Ayatollah.
Yes, and I'm very interested to speak to you about the Iranian government, the Iranian regime's interest or lack of not only all of the hostages, but the SAS. We've really, we're 15 minutes in, Ben. We haven't really mentioned the SAS. And in 1980, I mean, of course, we all know about rogue heroes, Ben, but 1980, that's rather off the radar. No one really knows much about the SAS, do they?
No, the SAS is at this point still a very obscure, very controversial part of the British Army. If you asked the British public, most of them would never have heard of the SAS. Their wartime exploits would not really be revealed until later. They were controversial because the SAS was already being used in Northern Ireland for purposes that some, there are accusations still that they were following a shoot to kill policy, that they were being used as a kind of hit squad by the IUC. Now, these are all still debated elements, but the SAS was in real trouble in 1980. I mean, there were rumors around that it might even be disbanded. It was those that knew about it, it was pretty controversial. And even within the army, it had a slightly ambivalent position, because although it was regarded as an elite by many people, but some of the top brass resented its swagger, resented its independence. But what almost nobody in Britain knew, apart from people in that part of government, was that since 1972, since the Munich Olympics massacre, the British had taken a policy decision to create a standing force that would be ready to tackle terrorist incidents if the police were unable to cope. And it's called military support to the civilian power. And it holds, and it still applies, that if at any point the civilian authorities cannot cope, they can call in the SAS. So by the time Prince's Gate happened, the SAS had already been training for 8 years for a similar situation, for something like this. And so each squadron in the SAS would spend, broadly speaking, 5 months on training ready for doing this, and then they would be deployed abroad, or they would be deployed to Northern Ireland. But in every year, there would be a period when they were expected to be training in Hereford for a moment not unlike this. The only thing they had never done was ever do a real one. You know, they had practiced and practiced and practiced. In fact, in the middle of the Hereford SAS barracks, there is a building called the Killing House, which is where the SAS train precisely for hostage situations. They are put into this house. They don't know what the layout of the rooms. Sometimes it's got gas in it. Sometimes it's dark. And they have to identify the hostage takers and, quote, neutralize them. And they have to then try and save the hostages, who, you know, and it's pretty violent stuff, but they train there day after day after day. So in a way, they were waiting for the Iranian Embassy siege.
The commanding officer of the Special Air Service, Michael Rose, presumably you spoke to him about this, or
I did.
Right.
Yes, I did indeed. No, Mike has been incredibly helpful on this. And he was the one in charge of 22 SAS. So he was on duty in Hereford Barracks when word came through. And he immediately deployed B Squadron, who were then on standby, to go to London. In fact, they began deploying before the politicians even knew what was happening. By sheer coincidence, really, one of the first policemen on the scene was a man called Dusty Gray, who had been in the SAS. He was now in the sort of hard dogs unit at Heathrow, but he spotted what was happening and went to the nearest telephone box and called up Hereford headquarters and said, get me Colonel Rose on the line. I need to tell him what's going on. So the SAS were on the way before the politicians authorized them to go.
Do you think they were a bit too keen to be on hand? I understand you've said that it was part of the protocol to use the SAS, but do you think they were a little bit too zealous in this right at the beginning?
In truth, actually, Oliver, I don't think they thought it was going to happen. They had been stood up and stood down so many times. They had trained so often that they climbed into those Range Rovers and headed to London. And I would say 99% of them thought, well, we'll be back home by the weekend. This is going to be another false alarm. There had been so many, so I don't think they were overzealous then. As time went on and as the siege progressed, and they ended up being stationed in the building next door. That, again, is what people don't really realize, is that Prince's Gate, number 16 Prince's Gate, was the Iranian Embassy. Number 15 Prince's Gate was the Royal College of General Practitioners. Doctor. It was the doctor's main central meeting spot and library in London. The SAS moved in there. Now, nobody, apart from a tiny handful of the top police officers on the scene, knew that from the first evening there was a force of heavily armed soldiers ready to go in next door. And as time went on, I think the tension all around this story begins to ratchet up very dramatically. And I think by the time we get to day 6, the SAS, some of them, are straining on the leash. They're ready to go.
Yeah, that's interesting. The 6 days, I remember, I think, reading about this. I think I had a cartoon book about it in the late 80s, which gives an indication for younger listeners how much of a big deal it was. But I remember being very harsh in sort of thinking, 6 days as a hostage, it's really not that bad. But reading the book and reading, day by day accounts of its horrific conditions, really. I mean, from the fact that the toilets keep on getting blocked up to, lack of food and everyone's on edge. I mean, I think it's easy for people to dismiss if they don't really know what it's like to go through such a difficult testing time.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And, there were 28 people in that building when it was attacked by these 6 gunmen. None of them, of course, had any inkling of what was about to happen to them. And they were perfectly ordinary people, just like you and me. They weren't like the SAS. They weren't trained for a situation like this. They weren't even like the gunmen, who had also trained for a situation like this. These were perfectly ordinary people on a drizzly day at the end of April. Some of them just happened to be in the embassy by pure chance. Most of the hostages were Iranian government employees. Some of them, top officials. Most of them secretarial staff and clerks and people, the medical officer and so on. But in addition, there were people who were simply happened to be in the waiting room. So there were 2 BBC journalists who play a critical part in the whole story. There was a Syrian journalist upstairs interviewing the charge d'affaires. There was a carpet salesman who just happened to have gone in that day in order to get some medical advice. There were 2 tourists. These were people swept up into a sort of terrifying situation that they couldn't control, had no idea how it was going to end. And in a way, that's one of the things I love about this story, is that it asks that eternal question of almost all history, which is, what would you do? Which of these many different reactions might you have had inside that embassy? And they all behave differently. We all like to think that we would behave in a particularly kind of heroic way when these things happen. Well, we're not all made of heroic material. There are some incredible acts of courage and bravery and so on. But most people want to survive, and those are the moments that really interest me, because I love that this story takes place in effect in one room inside the embassy. It's a really intense, boiling cauldron of relationships. So it's about personality and character, but it's also about the way that the hostages interact with each other, about the way that they communicate and indeed build up a kind of affinity in some ways with their captors, with the gunmen who are holding them. It's about the relationships that begin to emerge between the hostage negotiators on the police side and these highly volatile young men inside. So you've got a whole set of different stories. That's before we even get to the relationships between the politicians and the police and the SAS and the SAS and everyone else. So it's a much more multi-layered, multifaceted story than you and I believed when we were growing up.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show.
Absolutely. I mean, I would have assumed that given it was one of the sort of, I suppose, key embassies for the Khomeini's regime, that it would be entirely staffed by, devotees of the revolution, but that's not the case. And you soon see in your account of how the relationship between those who are really just there for a job and then those who are completely committed to the regime. It's really interesting to read about.
Absolutely. And 1 or 2 on the Iranian side, new appointees since the revolution, who are genuine fanatics. That they really are. They are people who are absolutely obsessively devoted to the idea of the Islamic State. And of course, as you know from reading the book, that leads to a confrontation in the end, which is lethal. I mean, the whole thing explodes. And what it explodes, and I said this at the beginning, in a way, it explodes because righteous men believe that God or destiny is talking to them, and that they have the right to use violence in order to achieve their ends. So it's not so far removed from the world we live in now. So yes, I mean, and that slow, and sometimes really quite agonizing ratcheting up of tension inside that building is extraordinary. The other thing to bear in mind in terms of context is that at the very moment that this is taking place in London, in Tehran, the US embassy is under siege, and inside it are 52 American diplomats and others who have been held hostage by this point since November. They've been there for 6 months, and they'll be there a good deal longer. 6 days before the Iranian embassy siege, President Carter authorized an attempt to rescue those hostages, which went appallingly wrong with the deaths of many soldiers. And it was an absolute disaster. It was a triumph for the Ayatollah, who then proclaimed that this was Allah, supporting the regime. So the initial reaction on the part of the British authorities was to assume, completely understandably, that this was in some way connected with that Iranian. And it was sort of, in a way, symbolically connected, but they were quite different events. Nonetheless, it brought an American aspect of the whole thing, because the British government then came under pressure from Washington saying, if you can solve this peaceably, we may be able to use that to get our people freed in Iran. So the whole thing begins to link up. So you've got this sort of internal story, but you've also got this really important geopolitical story taking place at the same time.
Do you think the Iranian regime would have rather that it had ended horrifically with, the hostages all being killed? Because they make statements saying that.
Yeah. I mean, there's an appalling moment in the middle of this siege when the Iranian foreign minister, who is a wild extremist, who would actually fall foul of the Iranian regime in the end and be executed, Gottsbadeh, pops up and gives an interview in which he says the Iranians inside the embassy will be pleased to give their lives as martyrs for the Iranian cause. So on the one hand, you've got the diplomats saying, you better get them out alive because they're our people. But you've also got public statements from the Iranian regime saying, if they're all killed, that is God's will, and they will have died for the revolution. At one point, there is even a direct threat to the British government that if the British government doesn't solve this in the way that Iran wants it solved, that thousands of devotees will descend on the embassy and do it themselves. I mean, whether that was a serious threat or not, there were enough extreme believers in the revolution resident in the UK at that point to make a very formidable private army and actually attack. I mean, the police genuinely worried that might be an eventuality. But did Iran want the whole place to go up in flames? I think they were pretty agnostic about it, to tell you that that's the wrong word, actually. But, I think they were sort of, it was going to happen. They wanted the Brits to sort it out. And if they didn't, and it all went horribly badly wrong, they would blame Britain. And then it would have worked to their advantage. They would have blamed Britain for failing to do it. And they would have hailed, as they did, those who died in the Iranian embassy as martyrs to the cause.
Yeah, win-win for them. Well, Margaret Thatcher, it's interesting looking at this siege because I guess, the decision to storm, the decision to not give in to the terrorists, this all comes from the top. And Margaret Thatcher's very clear early on that she won't bow down. Now, this is before the hunger strikes a year later, and then, of course, the Falklands in 82. And so I guess that makes it even more of a key sort of marker in the hardening of the Iron Lady.
Yes, very well put. I mean, Thatcher has been in power for less than a year at this point. The Iranian embassy siege is the first really substantial test that she faces. And yes, this all takes place within the context of rising violence in Northern Ireland. And she knows very clearly, and she wrote about this in her memoirs, she knows that what happens at the Iranian embassy siege is going to colour not just the rest of her premiership, but it's going to be looked at very closely by her opponents and by the IRA. They're going to watch this very closely. And pretty much from the beginning, she makes it clear that these gunmen are not going to get what they want. What they want is free passage out of Britain. They expected to hold hostages, then they would take them to the airport, they would be loaded onto a British Airways plane, and they would be flying back to home as heroes. Now, that sounds to us today incredibly naive, but actually it was not impossible. This had happened before. Britain had engaged in hostage negotiations and allowed gunmen to go free. There was a very good example of it that had happened under Heath. And I think there was an expectation on the part of the gunmen that this was going to happen again, that they would release their, by then, 26 hostages, and they would go home and there would be no bloodshed. That was the plan. They wanted to get their message out. They wanted it to be broadcast on the BBC. Thatcher's approach was, we'll talk to them. We will allow them to broadcast their message. We will keep them talking. We will provide them with food. We will negotiate with them to a certain extent. We will even, if necessary, talk to intermediaries, including diplomats and so on, who may be, which was one of the demands that the gunmen made. But she made it absolutely clear from the beginning, they are not leaving this country. They have committed a crime on British soil. They will be tried on British soil. Now, that's all very well, but it didn't give the police a lot to negotiate with, because they pretty much knew their hands were tied from the beginning. And it's one of the things that ticks down the tension in this story, is the police, their increasing desperation at the realization that they had nothing that they could really give the gunmen that was going to stop them. I mean, that can be argued. Maybe if they'd been able to bring in Arab ambassadors at one point, maybe it would have changed everything. But certainly the top negotiators realized by day 3 that Thatcher had left them in an almost impossible negotiating position. It was very clear. That was useful. That was helpful to them. They knew what they were supposed to be doing. But certainly, and some of the SAS top brass also realized pretty early on that this was going to end in bloodshed. There was no way this was going to end in a sort of peaceful withdrawal. So, yeah, I mean, for Thatcher, this was a really important moment. And the success of the Iranian Embassy siege made its mark on her premiership ever afterwards. I mean, it was hailed as an absolute triumph in Britain. It was the moment when Mrs. Thatcher's boys went in, the SAS became referred to as Thatcher's army. They emerged from almost total obscurity to being incredibly famous. And forever afterwards, every time Mrs. Thatcher did something particularly sort of aggressive or dramatic, she'd be pictured dressed as an SAS assailant, wearing sort of battle camouflage, abseiling down the outside of Big Ben. So it really gave it stamp. And there are people who believe that it absolutely reinforced her determination not to negotiate with terrorists of the homegrown variety as well. And perhaps even the Falklands too. Some of her sort of the more gung-ho aspects of that are, probably can be related back to what happened at the SAS embassy siege. She is credited with breathing new life into a kind of confident military machine in this country. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or not, we don't have to pass a judgment on it, but it is nonetheless a highly symbolic moment for this country.
Well, the siege itself, and I don't want to go through, in the time that it takes to boil an egg, I think you've written about. But I had always assumed, having watched the Lewis Collins vehicle Who Dares Wins, which is a guilty pleasure, but that it's a completely smooth operation because the result was a success. But that's not the case at all. And I was actually quite surprised. I suppose it's that old adage of, everyone has a plan until you get hit in the face.
That's right. Well, but again, it's one part of the myth-making was that somehow from the outside, when we were watching it on live television, it looked as if it had gone perfectly, as if the whole thing was incredibly smooth. I've now interviewed pretty much all the SAS people who were involved. And of course, they've not really been allowed to talk about it before. We've had to get special dispensation from the Ministry of Defence to allow them to break the oath of silence.
Would that take a long time to gain?
It did. I mean, I first started discussing this with them soon after I wrote Rogue Hero. So going back nearly a decade now, of having this conversation. And the SAS is such a complicated and interesting organism because on the one hand, it's highly secretive, but on the other, it's incredibly famous and very celebrated and everybody knows about it. So they're kind of caught between being both discreet and sort of telling their own stories. But that was a real breakthrough. But having interviewed pretty much all the people who were directly involved. And there's an old joke, isn't there, that, if everybody who claimed to have been involved in the Iranian Embassy siege had actually been involved in the Iranian Embassy siege, the balcony would have fallen off. There were only 4 people ever on that front balcony, and only one of them is still around. And he, before this book, had never talked about his experience. He had never given an interview to anybody. So piecing all of that together has been absolutely fascinating because it turns out that while it is broadly successful, although 2 hostages are dead by the end of it, and all but one of the gunmen. It does not end bloodlessly, which is what the police wanted. They initially regarded it as a disaster. They felt they had failed. They had not managed to save the lives of the people inside that building. So yes, it was, but it was hailed as a triumph. But when you pick apart the 11 minutes in which Operation Nimrod lasted, and it's not just one assault, there are 6 different teams going in there. Operation Nimrod is an incredibly complicated thing of many different moving parts. And even the bosses were expecting 40% casualties. They expected 40% of the people, both attacking and inside that building, to be injured or killed in the process. So from that respect, it was a huge success. But in some ways, it went wrong. I mean, everything always goes wrong. Nothing ever works. So for a start, one of the things, the front team, the ones that were going in through the bit that we all saw on breaking news, the idea was that they would blow out the front windows and then go in. But one of the problems they had was that they'd created their own problem, because years earlier, the SAS had been consulted by the Shah's regime on how they should reinforce the embassy. How could they protect it against protesters? And the SAS had said, well, you should armor the front. You should ensure that all the windows are bulletproof at the front, put reinforced glass in, and put in extra security doors. So in fact, the whole thing was impregnable from the ground floor. You couldn't get into it. And that's because the SAS had recommended that that's the way it should be. So initially they put far too big a plastic explosives charge on the front of the building, which meant that actually they practically blew the balcony off. I mean, it was so violent, that explosion. And it set fire to the interior as well when they threw in flashbangs. So they were wading through gas and smoke. Meanwhile, CS gas and CR gas is a particularly potent and very nasty form of tear gas, were being fired using tear gas canisters fired by polecat launchers, were being fired through the windows at the front of the building, the topmost. So the place was filled with smoke and dust and gunshots going off all over the place. Meanwhile, at the back, they were also trying to assault it using abseilers. And that also went wrong, because one of the abseilers became caught in his rope as the fire was taking hold underneath him, and was extremely bad. I mean, he was very nearly burned to death on that rope. I won't give away what happens, but so yes, like all military plans, it didn't go exactly as worked out. And I think no one was more astonished and more delighted than Hector Gullen, who is the sort of unsung hero of this story. He was the commander on the ground. He was Major Hector Gullen, and he was the one who drew up Operation Nimrod. He was coordinating it on the ground. He was the one in touch by radio with all the different moving parts that were going on. And no one was more astonished or more delighted than him when not a single, I mean, it was really a miracle that not a single of those attacking soldiers was even badly hurt. There were a few minor injuries, but no one was killed. It's almost unbelievable, the luck that went into this, because as Hector himself says, 2 minutes another way in another direction, and it would have been an absolute bloodbath.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
You quote Michael Rose towards the end of the book, the commander of the SAS, 22 SAS. And he says that the Iranian embassy siege is the worst thing that ever happened to the SAS. Now, he can't possibly mean that. I mean, for a number of reasons, one of which it inevitably results in an increase in recruitment of people very, keen to get involved. But secondly, it really does act as a deterrent, surely, for maybe not the IRA, who are still active, of course, on the mainland and in Northern Ireland, but for other terrorist groups who might think that London's a soft touch, just as these guys did.
Yes, I think that is true. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? There was not another hostage-taking incident in the UK of any major sort, as it were, a political sought after this. I mean, it made it clear that that's not the way you do it. There are better ways of getting what you want. I think when Mike says that, what he's really saying is that it utterly changed the perception of the SAS from the outside. And they saw this huge spike in applications from people who were really not qualified to apply. I mean, people were turning up at recruiting centres saying, give me a gun and a balaclava and I'll go and take on the Ayatollah's guys or whatever, And already there was and is a very established system for applying for the SAS from within the existing armed forces. So they didn't, it wasn't like they were crying out for recruits. I think what Mike really means is that they could no longer operate in the shadows after this. They could no longer be an invisible strike force deployed around the world to do interesting, dangerous, sometimes slightly questionable operations around the world. They were now in the glare of publicity. And we still see it today. There's a reason why, who dares wins and, are you tough enough and all those things where, ordinary people dress up and try and be SAS soldiers. That's because that myth has gone straight into the central cortex of British cultural life. And I think it did mean that they were no longer stealth warriors. They were no longer these roguish types from the war who could sort of slip in and slip out. The spotlight was on them, and it's still on them. They were being watched very closely from this moment. So I think it certainly changed the culture of the way the SAS was perceived. And I think it changed the way that Britain, in many ways, perceived itself. The SAS became an emblem of sort of national pride for good and ill. I mean, that's not necessarily something that was incredibly beneficial. Other foreign states began asking Britain to lend out the SAS when things like this happened. And again, that is, it's one thing to have a standing force of SAS ready to deal with a terrorist incident on this country's soil. It's another to have a set of hired guns who are being sent, as it were, around the world to operate on behalf of other countries. That's a slightly more complicated piece of moral juggling that has to go on there, particularly if you don't know quite what the regime is that you're helping out. So I understand what he means. The SAS became public property.
Yes, indeed. Well, I was really pleased that you included the parts of the coroner report, because that really does get to the heart, because there are many, I think, who criticised the results of the attack, where I think 5 of the 6 terrorists were killed. The coroner report is very interesting. Is that something that you were very keen to include, because it was controversial at the time and still is, I suppose?
Yes, I mean, I think it's extraordinarily timely, this conversation, because of course the SAS is under the spotlight again, and how soldiers behave in situations of extreme peril and extreme danger when they think the world isn't looking. That's a really important question. And the coroner was clear that these soldiers they killed 5 of the 6 gunmen. There is a very difficult moment, still highly controversial, at the end of the siege, when the one surviving gunman hid himself among the escaping hostages as they were being brought down the stairs. And it's maybe even more complicated by the fact that he was the youngest, the most naive. In some ways, he's the most sort of sympathetic among that group. And he was actually terrified. He's hiding among the hostages, and then he's spotted by the SAS. And there are 2 different diametrically opposed versions of what then happened. According to some eyewitnesses, he was being dragged back inside with what they perceived to be the intention to finish him off. That is flatly contradicted by officers in the SAS who say that could not and would not have happened. And of course, rightly, they point out that it did not happen. But perhaps, who knows? I mean, that is a key moment. He did survive. He was tried. He spent many, many years in British prisons and has since been released. So there is still controversy about whether they needed to kill everybody, whether they should have killed everybody. But and they're all very consistent on this, is they say, our job was to release the hostages. That was the mission, was to get them out. It was not to kill people. If we had to kill people, and we did have to kill people in order to achieve that, that was going to be part of the job. But that wasn't what we went in to do. And they're very clear on it. And the coroner, it was absolutely emphatic that they had done no more than they needed to do in order to achieve the ends they had to achieve. But it is still controversial. It doesn't slot easily into a kind of story of black and white and good and evil. And people do unexpected things when under incredible stress. But I sort of found myself slightly agreeing with the coroner, who stated quite openly when the jury was going off to give its verdict, who said, if you are facing, a masked man with a gun that is pointed at you and you are the SAS and your job is to go in and rescue hostages, what would you do? Well, I think we know the answer to that. And these guys, some of them are quite open about it. They say we had been trained to neutralize, the enemy and to save people as a consequence. And that is what they did.
Well, Ben, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. And the book, listeners, you've got to get this book. I devoured it in a day. It's wonderful stuff. So, Ben, thank you very much.
Oliver, it's been a huge pleasure, as always. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great history to come, so please do subscribe, follow, and all the rest. But until then, thank you, and good night.